A routine stop, flashing red and blue lights. A woman who had done nothing wrong, but in seconds she was handcuffed, accused of a crime she didn't commit. The cops smirked. They had done this before, planted evidence, fake reports. They thought this would be easy, but this time, they picked the wrong woman. Because Nia Lawson isn't just anyone, and she never loses. What happens next will change everything. Stay tuned, this is a takedown you won't forget. How many innocent people do you think never get the chance to fight back? And where are you watching from? Which country? Which city? Let's hear it in the comments. If this story pulled you in, hit subscribe, because the next one might hit even harder. Nia Lawson drove through the nearly empty streets, her fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. The city had settled into its late-night quiet, where only the distant hum of streetlights and the occasional honk from a car miles away broke the silence. It was the kind of stillness that usually made people feel safe, but Nia knew better. She was exhausted. The day had been long, filled with endless meetings and conversations that drained her. All she wanted was to get home, take off her shoes, and melt into her couch. She sighed, glancing at the time on her dashboard. Almost there. Then red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror. Her stomach didn't drop, but her muscles tensed. Her fingers instinctively tightened on the wheel before she forced herself to relax. A traffic stop, or at least, that's what they'd call it. Her eyes flicked to her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. She had stopped at every sign, signaled every turn. She had done everything right. And yet, here she was. She exhaled slowly, pulling over with careful precision. No sudden moves, no hesitation. She signaled, slowed, and stopped exactly the way she was supposed to. Her heart beat evenly as she shut off the engine. She cracked her window just enough to speak. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers spread, clearly visible, open, non-threatening. She had seen enough to know how quickly these situations could turn. 2 sets of footsteps approached, one to her window, one to her trunk. The first officer, Lawson, moved with arrogance. Late 30s, stocky build, shaved head. His hand rested on his holster, not for protection, but for intimidation. A message. The second officer, Tate, lingered at the back of her car, scanning, waiting, not just standing guard, waiting. Nia took it all in, every detail, every movement. Lawson smirked down at her. License and registration. Nia met his gaze without hesitation. Calm, collected. Can you tell me why I was pulled over? His smirk widened. You ran a stop sign. A lie. Nia knew she hadn't run a stop sign. She had counted every second at each one, just like she always did. But arguing wouldn't change anything. No, I didn't, she said, her voice steady. Lawson chuckled, shaking his head as if he had heard this 1,000 times. That so? Then it happened. Lawson, look at this! Tate's voice cut through the night air. Nia didn't turn. She didn't need to. She already knew. Too fast. Too rehearsed. Lawson stepped away from her window. There was a rustling sound, a brief pause. Then, well, what do we have here? When he turned back, he was holding a small plastic bag between his fingers. White powder. Cocaine. Nia's heartbeat didn't spike. Her face didn't change. She expected this. That's not mine. Lawson laughed sharply, shaking his head. That's funny, 'cause it was in your car. Her gaze flicked to Tate. He stood a step behind Lawson now, watching, his expression unreadable, waiting for her reaction. She gave them nothing. No panic, no shock, no outrage. She let the silence stretch before speaking again. And I suppose your body cam caught the moment you found it. A pause, a hesitation. Tate shifted slightly. Just for a second. A mistake. Lawson recovered fast. He scoffed, lifting the bag slightly as he took a step forward. Step out of the vehicle. Nia obeyed. She unbuckled her seatbelt, moved slowly, deliberately, and pushed the door open. Every movement controlled, every step calculated. She wouldn't give them a reason. Lawson grabbed her wrist, twisting it slightly as he snapped the cuffs on. Cold steel against her skin. Possession with intent, he said smugly. That's serious, Miss Lawson. The cuffs locked, and Tate took a step closer, arms crossed. Nia didn't resist, didn't react. She kept her breathing even, kept her expression neutral. This wasn't over, not even close. The ride to the station was quiet, on Nia's end at least. Cuffed in the back seat of the patrol car, she kept her breathing steady, her gaze fixed out the window. The city rolled by, streetlights casting flickering shadows inside the vehicle. She could feel the weight of Lawson's eyes on her through the rearview mirror, waiting for her to crack, to react. She didn't give him the satisfaction. "Got nothing to say now, huh?" Lawson sneered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Not so smart anymore, are you?" Nia remained silent. Tate chuckled from the passenger seat. "Oh, she'll be talking soon. They always do, once they realize how deep they're in it." Another pause. Nia could hear the satisfaction in their voices, the arrogance. They thought they had already won. Lawson exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "See, that's the problem with people like you." She didn't. Tate strutted ahead, exaggerating his movements, making sure everyone saw them. "Got ourselves a real winner here," he announced. Caught her red-handed. Cocaine, clear intent to distribute. Open and shut. Some officers nodded, uninterested. Others barely looked up. One person, however, was watching carefully. Officer Nash, young, sharp-eyed, and still new enough to the force to see things differently. He stood near the booking desk, arms crossed, observing the way Lawson and Tate carried themselves. There was something off. Nia saw him watching. She made a mental note. Lawson dropped a folder onto the desk, smirking at the officer processing the paperwork. "Let's get her in the system. Make it official." The officer barely glanced at Nia as he took the file, flipping through the pages. Nash, still standing nearby, took a step closer. His eyes scanned the arrest report. Something wasn't right. "Where's the inventory log?" Nash asked casually. Lawson didn't look up. "What?" Nash gestured to the report. "The drugs. There's no proper chain of custody. No detailed inventory of where exactly they were found, how they were handled. Nothing." Tate scoffed. "It was in her car. We bagged it. What more do you need?" Nash didn't back down. "Every bust has to follow protocol. This is missing key details." Lawson's jaw tensed. "You questioning how we do our jobs, rookie?" Nash held his ground. "Just saying it needs to be properly documented." Tate smirked. "Relax, kid. This one's a done deal. Just sign it off." Nia watched everything. She saw Nash's hesitation, the way his fingers twitched against his side. He wasn't convinced. She could work with that. Even in custody, Nia wasn't the one losing control. Sitting in the holding area, her posture remained relaxed, composed. She wasn't slouched. She wasn't fidgeting. She was waiting. Lawson and Tate lingered outside, occasionally glancing at her. She could feel their frustration. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't crying or pleading or breaking down. She was too calm, and that made them uneasy. Tate leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Why isn't she saying anything?" Lawson exhaled sharply. "She's waiting for a lawyer. Thinks she's smart." Tate chuckled. "She's stalling. Trying to psych us out." Lawson scoffed. "Won't work." Nia smirked, because it already was. Nash sat at his desk, staring at the report in front of him. His fingers tapped absently against the wood as his eyes traced the words again and again. Something wasn't right. He knew it. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. His gut had twisted the moment Lawson and Tate paraded into the station with their so-called big bust. Nia Lawson didn't look like someone caught red-handed. She wasn't scared. She wasn't desperate. She was waiting, calculating, and that meant something. But what? But what? Nash exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. If he spoke up, there would be consequences. He was still new to the department, low on the totem pole. Lawson and Tate, they had years under their belts. They were the kind of officers everyone knew not to cross. Calling them out wouldn't just be risky. It could end his career. So why couldn't he let it go? Nia sat in the holding cell, her posture composed. She knew patience was key. The pieces were already shifting, and she needed just the right moment to push. A shadow passed near the bars. Nash. He hesitated before stepping closer. Nia lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. She saw it. Doubt. "Something on your mind, officer?" she asked smoothly. Nash exhaled through his nose. "I read your report." Her lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "And?" He didn't respond right away. "You don't seem too worried," he finally said. Nia tilted her head slightly. "Should I be?" Nash's jaw tightened. "Lawson and Tate," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "They don't mess up their paperwork." "Interesting," Nia murmured. "Is that what you're worried about, that they messed up?" Nash's fingers twitched at his side. That wasn't what he was worried about, and she knew it. "Look," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "If there's something you want to say, now's the time. Nia leaned forward slightly. "And what do you think I'd say?" Nash swallowed. He wasn't sure. Nia let the silence stretch before speaking again. "You ever notice a pattern, Nash?" His brows furrowed. "What kind of pattern?" She didn't answer. She only held his gaze. And then, ever so subtly, she smirked. It was small, barely there. But it was enough. A push. Just enough to make him start digging. Nash sat in front of his computer, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He shouldn't be doing this. He should just let it go. But he couldn't. Nia's words stuck with him. "You ever notice a pattern?" So he searched. Past arrests, cases involving Lawson and Tate. He dug through the files, scanning through charges, reports, patterns, and then he saw it. Same story, different names. Routine stops turning into major drug busts. Always conveniently finding narcotics in the suspect's vehicle, always airtight reports. And every time someone challenged the charges, the evidence held up. But why? Nash leaned closer. He checked timestamps, officer logs. Then something else jumped out at him. Body cam footage. For nearly every case, there were gaps, not just technical errors, moments where the footage mysteriously cut off. His stomach turned. This wasn't just a mistake. This was calculated. He clicked on a more recent case, one from just 2 months ago. Suspect claimed the drugs weren't his. Just like Nia. He pulled up Lawson's body cam footage, watched carefully. The suspect had been pulled over. He denied the drugs were his. Lawson had smirked, stepped away, then cut. The next frame, Lawson holding up a bag of cocaine. Nash's blood ran cold. It was right there, the answer, the proof that something was wrong. He clenched his fists. This wasn't a mistake. This was a setup. Nash's heart pounded as he pulled up Nia's arrest footage. The cameras were rolling. He fast-forwarded, scanning every second. Then he saw it, Lawson, near the trunk. His hand slipping into his own pocket, a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but Nash saw it, and it changed everything. He exhaled sharply, pushing away from the screen. He had enough to suspect foul play. Now he had a decision to make. The tension in the precinct thickened like a storm rolling in. Officers exchanged glances, whispers passing between them like an invisible current. Something was happening. Something big. And then the doors slammed open. Agent Dorian Steele strode in with a presence that commanded attention. A seasoned federal agent, his sharp gaze cut through the room like a blade. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He didn't need to. "Where is she?" Steele's voice carried authority, his eyes scanning the room. The room fell silent. Even the officers who weren't involved instinctively stepped back. No one wanted to be in the way. At the booking desk, Lawson and Tate barely concealed their irritation. They had expected a quiet night, just another routine arrest. They hadn't expected this. Tate scoffed, crossing his arms. "Who the hell are you?" Steele didn't even glance at him. Instead, he turned to Officer Nash, who had been standing near the computer station. "Where is Nia Lawson?" Nash hesitated. He had spent the last few hours wrestling with his conscience, digging through evidence, finding patterns. He had questions. So many questions. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just another arrest. "In holding," Nash said. Steele nodded once before shifting his attention to Lawson and Tate. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something dangerous in the way he looked at them. "Get her, now!" Nia sat on the metal bench inside the holding cell, her posture as steady as it had been the entire night. She had been waiting for this. The moment the heavy door creaked open, she didn't look surprised. She looked ready. Nash stepped inside first, but it was the man behind him that caught Nia's attention. Agent Steele. For the first time that night, she smiled. "You took your time," she said smoothly. Steele's lips twitched slightly. "Had to make an entrance." Behind him, Lawson and Tate hovered near the doorway, their expressions dark. "She's already booked," Lawson said, jaw tight. "You're wasting your time, Agent." Steele ignored him. "Miss Lawson, you're coming with me." Lawson took a step forward. "You can't!" Steele turned sharply. "I can, and I am." His voice carried a weight that stopped Lawson mid-sentence. Steele reached into his pocket and flashed a federal badge. "She's no longer under your jurisdiction," he stated coldly. "Now get out of my way!" The atmosphere in the precinct had shifted. Officers moved cautiously, lowering their voices. The presence of federal agents wasn't something they saw every day, and definitely not like this. Steele wasted no time. He led Nia straight to a private room, shutting the door behind them. Nash hesitated outside, lingering near the hallway. Inside, Steele studied Nia for a long moment. "You good?" he finally asked. Nia smirked. "Never better." Steele exhaled. "We've got a problem." Nia leaned forward slightly. "Which part? The fact that I was framed, or the fact that two corrupt officers think they got away with it?" Steele's eyes darkened. "They didn't." He pulled out a tablet, tapping the screen. Surveillance logs, digital evidence retrieval. His team had been working behind the scenes, pulling security footage, running analysis. And what they found? Damning. Steele turned the screen toward Nia. "Look at this!" The footage played, a clear shot of Lawson near her trunk. Then, his hand, slipping into his own pocket, moving too quickly, too deliberately, and then the bag of drugs. Nia's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly against the table, caught, on, camera. Steele let the footage loop once before locking the screen. "That's enough to start an internal investigation." Nia tilted her head. "Start?" Steele met her gaze. "We need more." Nia chuckled under her breath. "Lucky for you, I planned ahead." She reached into her pocket and retrieved something small, a sleek recording device. Steele's brows lifted slightly. Nia placed it on the table, tapping it once. "I never go anywhere without backup." With a flick of his fingers, Steele activated the playback. And then, the voices. Lawson and Tate's. Clear, unfiltered. The smug arrogance in their tone was unmistakable. "She thinks she's smart. Doesn't matter. By the time she figures it out, she'll be buried in charges. They never fight back. They just take the deal." "Exactly. Open and shut." Silence. Steele leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Well, that'll do it." Nia crossed her arms. "Told you." Steele didn't smile, but there was something approving in his expression. "This ends tonight." The confrontation was inevitable. Lawson and Tate had seen too many wins to expect a loss. They walked into the interrogation room with the same confidence they always had. That confidence didn't last long. Steele stood at the head of the room, Nash beside him. On the table, the tablet was propped up. The screen was paused, waiting. Lawson rolled his shoulders, unimpressed. "What's this, some scare tactic?" Tate smirked. "We've done nothing wrong." Steele pressed play, and just like that, their own voices betrayed them. Lawson's smirk faltered. Tate shifted in his seat. Then the security footage played. The moment Lawson reached into his pocket, the room went silent, and for the first time, Lawson had nothing to say. The fallout was swift. Nia walked out of the station free. Lawson and Tate? Not so lucky. The weight of their actions crashed down hard. The moment the internal affairs team got involved, the case against them unraveled. Too many lies. Too many convenient busts. Nash watched as they were led out in cuffs, a sight no one had expected. Nia met his gaze as she passed. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. Nash nodded once. And with that, justice was served. The air inside the precinct was thick with tension. Officers who once carried themselves with confidence now moved carefully, avoiding eye contact. The weight of what had just unfolded sat heavy on the room. At the center of it all, Lawson and Tate sat in silence, their usual arrogance stripped away. The handcuffs around their wrists weren't just metal restraints, they were the end of their unchecked power. Nash stood among the gathering officers, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. He had seen men like them walk free too many times. He knew how easily corruption could be swept under the rug. But not this time. This time, there were recordings, video footage, and undeniable proof. And this time, justice wasn't slipping through the cracks. The arrest of Lawson and Tate agent Steele stood before them, his expression unreadable. He had been in the game long enough to see men like Lawson and Tate crumble the moment the walls closed in. And they were crumbling. Lawson tried to hold on to his composure, but his jaw was locked, his shoulders tense. Tate, always the one with a sharp tongue, had nothing to say. The evidence had spoken for itself. "You both have the right to remain silent," Steele said, his voice firm, unwavering. Lawson scoffed. "This is a joke." Steele didn't even blink. "The only joke was thinking you'd get away with it." A murmur passed through the room. No one had ever spoken to Lawson like that before, not in his own precinct. Tate shifted in his seat. "You can't seriously be." We have surveillance footage, Steele cut in smoothly. Audio recordings, digital evidence. You lied on official reports, planted evidence, and used your badge to manipulate the system. But you already know that, don't you? Neither of them responded. You've had plenty of people afraid to challenge you, Steele continued. But those days are over. An officer stepped forward to escort them out. Lawson jerked back slightly, but the cuffs held him in place. The fight was gone from him. As they were led through the station, officers who once laughed at their jokes followed their lead or looked the other way now averted their gazes. No one was stepping in to save them. Lawson turned his head just enough to glare at Nash. You think this makes you a hero? Nash met his gaze, unflinching. No, he said, just a cop doing his job. Lawson scoffed, but his silence afterward was telling. For the first time in years, he had no power. Nash's vindication, Nash exhaled, his hands still clenched at his sides. It was over. For months he had sensed something was off. The numbers didn't add up, the arrests seemed too perfect, the reports too clean, but he had been new. Just another officer trying to find his place. So he stayed quiet. But not anymore. Nash had spent the last 24 hours digging, finding patterns, seeing things he should have noticed long ago. And when the truth stood in front of him, undeniable, he made a choice, even if it put a target on his back, even if it meant crossing senior officers. Because at the end of the day, a badge wasn't a free pass for corruption. He watched as Lawson and Tate were led toward the exit, reporters already gathering outside, their cameras flashing. Their downfall was now public. And for the first time, Nash felt like he was wearing his badge for the right reason. Nia's freedom. Inside the precinct, Nia Lawson stood tall. Only hours ago, she had been booked, processed, and thrown into a holding cell. Tate had smirked. Lawson had taunted her. They thought they had won. Now? She was walking out. Every step she took felt like a quiet victory. The weight of wrongful accusations didn't linger. Because she had never been the victim. She had been the reckoning. Nia walked past the officers who had stayed silent when she was being falsely accused. She saw the uncertainty in their faces. Some looked relieved, some uneasy. A few looked scared, scared of what else might come to light. She stopped when she reached Nash. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she gave him a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of what he had done. Nash returned the gesture. He didn't need a thank you. He didn't do it for that. He did it because it was right. Nia turned, stepping toward the exit. The cool night air hit her face as the doors closed behind her. And just like that, justice had been served. The fallout, the next morning, the precinct was different. The weight of Lawson and Tate's arrest still hung in the air. Their desks sat empty. Their names, once untouchable, were now attached to criminal charges. Internal Affairs had launched a full investigation. Officers who had looked the other way were being questioned. Every past arrest Lawson and Tate had made was being re-evaluated. For years, they had built their power on intimidation and silence. But now, the cracks had turned into a complete collapse. Nash sat at his desk, staring at his badge. He knew this wasn't over. Corruption didn't disappear overnight, but this was a start, and for the first time, he was on the right side of it. Miles away, in the comfort of her apartment, Nia Lawson watched the news unfold. The footage of Lawson and Tate being led out in cuffs played on repeat. Headlines flashed across the screen. Corrupt officers arrested in shocking scandal. Systemic abuse of power uncovered. Federal investigation launched. Nia leaned back, arms crossed. She had seen men like Lawson and Tate before. Men who thought power gave them immunity. They always fell. She had made sure of it. But this was only the beginning. She reached for her phone, scrolling through messages from contacts, lawyers, and journalists. There was more work to do. Because for every Lawson and Tate taken down, there were more still standing. And Nia Lawson wasn't done yet. The precinct wasn't the same. It never would be. The precinct wasn't the same. It never would be. The scandal had rocked the department to its core. Lawson and Tate's arrests had been just the beginning. Investigations spread like wildfire, exposing a network of misconduct, cover-ups, and abuse of power that had been festering for years. And now, everything was crumbling. Nia Lawson sat across from Agent Steele, her fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface of the conference table. The room was sterile, bright fluorescent lights, blank white walls and a thin file resting between them. Inside that file was the truth. Steele slid it toward her. "Thought you might want to see the latest developments." Nia opened it, scanning the pages. Indictments, suspensions, internal affairs recommendations, some names she expected. Others? They were surprises. "You really shook things up," Steele said, leaning back in his chair. Nia exhaled, her expression unreadable. It was never just about Lawson and Tate. Steele nodded. "No, but taking them down was the first domino, and now the whole system was being re-examined. Dozens of wrongful convictions had already been overturned. Past cases were under review. Officers who had stayed silent were being forced to answer for their complicity. "You know this isn't over," Steele continued, watching her carefully. Nia closed the file. She knew. Corruption didn't vanish overnight. It adapted. It found new ways to hide. But that didn't mean it couldn't be hunted down. She met Steele's gaze. "It never is." Across town, Nash stood in his office, staring at a board filled with names, dates, and pinned reports. The past few weeks had been a blur. Ever since Lawson and Tate's downfall, Nash had been working with internal affairs, helping to dismantle the network they left behind. Officers who had enabled them, whether out of fear, loyalty, or self-interest, were being held accountable. Some had already resigned. Others were fighting to keep their badges. And then there were those who had been waiting for change. For the first time, they weren't afraid to speak up. Nash rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in. The truth was, this wasn't easy. It wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about rebuilding trust. "Rough morning?" Nash turned to see Captain Rourke, one of the few higher-ups he respected, standing in the doorway. "Long one," Nash admitted. Rourke stepped inside, arms crossed. "I read your report. You're being thorough." Nash scoffed. "Can't afford not to be." Rourke studied him for a moment. "You did the right thing, Nash." Not everyone would have made that call. Nash met his gaze. "More people need to." Rourke nodded. "And maybe now they will." It wasn't just about Lawson and Tate anymore. It was about the entire culture that had allowed them to exist. And Nash wasn't backing down. Nia stood on her balcony. The city sprawled before her, bright, restless, alive. But beneath the glow of streetlights and neon signs, shadows moved. Some were fading, others were just beginning to take shape. She had fought before, she had won before, and she had lost before. But tonight wasn't a win or a loss. Tonight was a reckoning. Her phone buzzed in her palm. Updates from Steele, a journalist's lead, a private number she recognized but didn't open, yet she would, when the time was right. Her thoughts kept circling back to Nash, a cop caught in the system, expected to look the other way, but he didn't. He chose to see. He chose to act. And that choice, it changed everything. Because if one cop could break the cycle, maybe others could too. Maybe change didn't start with grand speeches and courtroom showdowns. Maybe it started in moments like this. In choices like his, the war wasn't over. It had just found its next battlefield. Nia exhaled, slow and steady. Then, without a second thought, she turned and stepped inside. The fight was waiting, and she was ready.